Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is Ukraine War live chat with Tim White, who I think it's possibly the fourth time that Tim has been on this channel. So thank you, Tim, for coming on again and welcome. Do you want to just, for those newer viewers that I've picked up along the way, do you just want to give a quick intro to yourself again?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Good to be here again. Welcome to any newcomers, people maybe coming from my own Twitter feed. I've got quite a following on Twitter now. And every single day I do what you might term a blog or a thread with all the important news. Try to leave out most of the gory bits. You can get those elsewhere, but add a little bit of nuance. And I think I'm the only person who's been doing these threads since day one of the war. Some latecomers have come along and joined in to reap some of the glory for their own profit or whatever. But my heart is very firmly in Ukraine. I've worked with numerous organizations out there doing training, media training, made some documentaries, tried to tackle corruption a little bit in my own way. And so when my own friends were getting invaded, bombed, dying, signing up for service, it obviously became very personal to me, Jonathan, and hence why I felt the real need to document what was happening, both to try to advise without fear or favor, be completely honest in my assessment, although my heart is with Ukraine, to say what's really probably going on as best we know it, but also to continue to highlight, as soon became evident, which we all knew would happen, the horrendous war crimes. Russia just does not care about anything, any rules, any person other than Putin, and he only cares about anyone who may be a threat to him. So that's me, and that's why I'm here, and that's why we're chatting again.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a really similar kind of outlook, a really similar content. Like I do it as a video blogger, you do it on Twitter, and actually I use an awful lot of your tweets because Twitter is that aggregation of news sources where you only have to go to one site to get everything. And so people might look at my videos and go, well, it's just off Twitter, but actually it's referring to so many different sources. It's just aggregated in one place. But actually you are one of the threads that I use very often in my news pieces in the morning. And like you just said, it's really important to be honest with our audience, honest with ourselves in terms of, you know, what is actually going on, what is the truth of the matter. There's no point fooling ourselves because it'll come back and bite us on the arse later. So we need to be honest with ourselves and therefore honest with our audience. I mean, do you find that that's an important aspect? I mean, you've already mentioned this, that being able to communicate the good, the bad and the ugly on both sides.
Yeah, it is more difficult, and one tries, as a journalist, even though I am quite partial, obviously, one tries to not seem to be, and tries not actually to be too happy when, you know, a massive attack on Russia kills lots of people. You try to always remember these are people. They shouldn't be here. They're ignorant. They are brainwashed. Okay, they are stupid. They must know right from wrong. But still, they're somebody's son, brother. And I try to avoid hatred in my heart. And sometimes it's very difficult, but it does get in the way of objective journalism. And similarly, it's very, very difficult, infinitely more difficult to report the likes of the strike recently in Zaporizhia on the 128th Brigade, when clearly it was a horrible breakdown in all sorts of rules, communications, and probably someone that leaked the information could have easily been a villager who'd seen this big gathering of people, which shouldn't happen anymore, especially not outdoors with drones around. A drone was watching them. And it's just awful documenting those sorts of things similarly. But the people you feel most sorry for are the real innocents, the children, the wives, the people, elderly, who even cannot leave Avdiivka even now, and other places that are similarly seeing the real horrors of war at the moment. And it's really for them, the innocents, and for Ukraine as a nation and the people who've discovered their identity after over 70 years of Soviet repression, remember, and prior to that also attempts to have Ukrainian independent statehood snuffed out brutally, and to try to support them and get what is absolutely their right. Ukraine has long been a country, despite what Russia says. But to make your original point, it is difficult at times, but I do think it's very important. A lot of these threads just purely report all pro-Ukrainian stuff, and on the other side we have what have been termed the mill bloggers, purely posting all pro-Russian stuff. And it's important to get a nuance and a mix between the two. And sometimes you get criticism for that, and I know other journalists have as well. But you just have to go with the flow and do what you feel is right. I am a trained journalist. I was a former news editor and sports editor. And so hopefully I know what I'm doing, and quite a few people seem to appreciate what I'm doing too.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, what you were just talking about just reminded me of this. This is something I was going to talk about in one of my later videos, but might as well bring it up now. You talk about that hit on the 128th. So what's happening? Well, there was this awards ceremony where they're handing out medals, but it's really close to the front line, something like I think 18 kilometers from the front line, and one was wondering whether that was a sensible thing to do to accumulate probably pretty good troops. If they're receiving medals and they've done a good job, you get them all together in a single place and they get hit by an Iskander missile. Now, what was interesting about this, Dara Masako here says, a few observations about Russian forces in recent weeks that I'm watching: improvements in targeting, continued assaults in Avdiivka, possible missile hoarding and new loitering munitions. But she starts with this. Last week, Russian forces used an Iskander SRBM missile, so it's a ballistic missile, to target the Ukrainian force, 128th Brigade, and potential CP during an award ceremony, killing experienced artillery teams. This gathering is a fleeting event or a time-sensitive target. So the Russians either had foreknowledge of it or observed it by drone footage and had the ability to quickly call an Iskander strike in, which is CAA combined arms army level asset. I haven't seen the Russian forces strike a time-sensitive target like this with the Iskander SRBMs. Correct me if I've missed one. And usually they are used to target fixed sites like buildings, villages, bridges, etc., because they want them to arrive on target, meaning last week's strike against 128 means they feel confident enough in their targeting loop to launch this type of missile against a time-sensitive target. It suggests improvement in their recon strike loop. Anyway, I just wanted to bring attention to that because I think it's quite significant that actually there's a missile that usually hits, say, a building or usually some kind of civilian infrastructure or energy infrastructure, is now hitting a time-sensitive troop target, and that could be a bit of a problem for the Ukrainians going forward. Anyway, I thought I'd throw that one in there.
Yeah, I don't think it's the first one though. I would say Hroza, where the refuneral, if you like, was taking place, was also time sensitive. And although it probably went on a little longer, I think from the drone footage we've got, I would be very surprised if it was just loitering undetected and picked it up. I think they did know something was happening. Yeah. I think there probably was a leak from maybe within the public, not within the army, I wouldn't suggest. But it was still, so many rules have been broken and so many lessons not learned by having this gathering outdoors, fairly easy to see, so close to the front line, as you say. And reportedly, although there's no actual evidence of this, the Russians were saying they were using mobile phones as well. But I think that's probably just to deflect from the fact that they knew in advance, they had intelligence and they had a drone up in the sky and they did target well. But also, as they did in Hroza when they killed over 50 people, I think, in the end, wasn't it? With,
59, I think it's up to now.
A single strike on a funeral with no military there, or the only link to a military were friends, relatives of this person who was being reburied, having originally died near the front line.
So much to talk about. If anyone has questions, please get your super chats in so they highlight the questions to Tim and myself, if you would care for my opinion. That would be fantastic. I want to start, I guess, with the counteroffensive because there's so much talk about this. Some people saying it was a failure because territorial didn't make any it did make gains, but not significant gains in the way they originally hoped. I've talked a lot about how after the first week, they completely rejigged their objectives for the counteroffensive, realizing that they weren't going to take 30 kilometers a day just doing this kind of blitzkrieg attack, that actually it was totally different. And then from that point onwards, it came about attriting equipment, which I think they've done really successfully, and about hitting places in, say, Crimea and even in Russia. And they've got the Black Sea Fleet to move out of Sevastopol. So it depends how you measure the success, what the metrics are. What are your thoughts? Given that's my intro, what are your thoughts on a counteroffensive?
Pretty similar. I've seen your stuff, Jonathan, and I would have to agree. Yes, there was a change in tactic. I think I think the last time we spoke, actually, we both commented about the now pretty well known but very successful, not just Ukrainian tactic, but previously, you don't have to fight just on the front line. You can defend on the front line and hit in the rear, hit the supplies. And as we saw in Kharkiv and then in Kherson, the enemy will not be able to support their own front line and will have to retreat as they did successfully. But I think what has been surprising to me, and probably therefore to the commander-in-chief and the general staff of Ukraine, and probably some allies, is just how resourced Russia has been and how they haven't apparently gone too short of fuel for their army, at least, not for the drivers in some of the cities in the occupied territory and indeed throughout Russia. But they still, despite the figures that we see every day, which are likely to be at least indicative of the sorts of losses that Russia are suffering, just how many armored personnel carriers, how many tanks they still have. And yes, they're wheeling out the old ones, and they clearly don't care about manpower. But I think Ukraine probably thought they'd have been able to make more of an impression, because Russia wouldn't have been able to mobilize that much equipment and get it to the front in time. But Ukraine's still plugging away, trying to hit the supply routes, trying to get fire control. Just got fire control over another fairly important road, I'm told, this morning, and also killing of troops at the front line when they're just being sacrificed, as they have been out in Avdiivka. But
what fire control road are you talking about? Just out of interest.
I'm not supposed to say about it, but I think we'll hear about it hopefully in another 24 hours or so, having talked to a few people this morning, spent a couple of hours on the phone.
Because just to interrupt you a little bit, it's quite interesting. I've seen, hopefully you can all see the map there, but I've seen Bakhmut has tailed off in the last week in terms of Ukrainian pushing. They're not even seemingly pushing in the places they were. But interestingly, Robotina area has seemed to have come alive a little bit again, and the Ukrainians are having some success in this Verbove area to the north of Verbove, where some of the mappers are showing some fairly decent Ukrainian advances there, and some people talking about, hey, watch Verbove and north of there over the next few days, because it could be that the Ukrainians are having some joy there. So anyway, I thought I'd throw that in.
Yes, that's true. Verbove is key at the moment. I think Ukraine's actually been more on the defensive and just entrenched in positions in Bakhmut, which has been a little disappointing. There was real hope that they would retake the city, but again, Russia poured a lot of troops in, as they did a little bit to the east and to the south, to the north in Liman and Siversky direction, where they've really been trying to advance further into Kharkiv territory. And Ukraine has had it all on and had to supply extra troops into some of those regions to make sure they didn't lose ground. But I think it's a testament to the organization and to the central command and the general staff in Ukraine that they haven't lost any territory, which is quite remarkable. I mean, Bakhmut was the last significant success for Russia, and it took them, was it 10 months, 11 months, I think, to get there from the first approach to the town. And the question is, the Russians hoping that the supply lines, i.e. from the US and allies, will interrupt their progress and bring an end to the war. And on the Ukraine side, they're hoping that eventually that the Russians will run out of weapons. The supplies from North Korea certainly don't help, and Iran possibly as well. They've stepped up manufacturing as well, but they're still using more than they can fight with at the moment. Really, I believe that they're concentrating on drones and missiles, which is maybe not a bad tactic, but at the same time, it leaves the front line incredibly exposed. They're not able to make tanks, artillery, munitions anywhere near as quickly as they ought to protect any artillery. So making progress forward is going to be difficult. And it would appear that now Shoigu, Gerasimov and Putin are just intent on trying to cause pain to Ukraine and the people of Ukraine. And as has been well prophesized already, almost certainly just waiting for the temperatures to dip a little further to try and attack the energy industry again. But it is much better protected than it was 12 months ago.
I think your point about not giving up considerable amounts of territory is such an important one. I think we take it for granted. Like the Ukrainians have done such a good job of defending when the Russians have shown themselves to be a bit of a threat. So we saw up in this area, sort of west-southwest of Svatova in Novaya Rivka, where the Russians made some serious gains for a few days, and then the Ukrainians put a stop to that and plugged it and pushed back. They've been pressuring the Russians up in the Liman, Pershi, Kupiansk, Ivanivska, Yahidny area up here, and the Ukrainians have contained them. They've contained them, as you say, along Seversk broadly, and in the Serebyansky forest, and north of there in the Liman direction. We have seen them amazingly defend Avdiivka, given the sheer volume of equipment and troops that the Russians have thrown at that. It's happened at Vuhledar again. They've held them at Mariinka, Krasnohorivka, all of these places where the Russians have pressured. And at the same time, we have, and maybe this is what you're talking about, some really good news coming from the Dnipro River, where the Ukrainians are possibly looking at getting across it. I originally said that would have been part of a pincer movement that went together with this move down towards Tokmak, but that move kind of stalled, and so I think they stalled here. But they do have a lot of troops and equipment that they can bring to bear if the opportunity arises in the Dnipro River. So there are some elements of good news for the Ukrainians going forward into this autumn and winter period.
Yeah, and I would just really remind people that Kherson, some people were saying, oh, it might happen, but it happened very quickly. In Kharkiv, there was almost no expectation. It was a real surprise. I think it was on a Saturday morning. A lot of things seem to happen on a Saturday, that suddenly there are messages coming through, we've abandoned this town, we've abandoned, from the Russian sources I was reading, and then realizing that everyone from the Russian army has just suddenly said goodbye to virtually all of Kharkiv. It was quite astonishing. And so things can happen very quickly. The bit you're pointing to at the moment in the Kherson region, trying to cross the river natural barrier, is very important, yes, and progress has been made. I think I tweeted last night that more progress had been made by Ukraine pushing through the forest south of Khrinki, and that will inevitably cause more Russian troops to be pushed into the area and possibly withdrawn from Tokmak and the Zaporizhia region that's currently occupied a little bit further northeast. There you go. And that could allow the pincer movement that you talked about coming off, because there's still a real threat. That Verbovi ledge on the right of the screen as you look, and down further in the southern area beyond Kherson, it might be difficult for Russia to contain two offensives at the same time. If they move troops out of one to defend the region they hold south of the river in Kherson, they could leave themselves a little bit exposed further up in Zaporizhia.
Yeah, and this road could also be the road you talk that this is an important road to interdict here. That is a supply route across the length of the Dnipro River. I guess the difference between the Kharkiv counteroffensive and any counteroffensive that takes place now is the time the Russians have had to dig in. And
Yes.
although so much of this southern front line is fortified with 2 to 3, sometimes 4 lines of fairly well-built trenches and minefields, even though it doesn't look like there are many trenches around the Kherson Oblast, there are still trenches, and there are still dugouts within tree lines and all those kind of things. So I think it will be a real challenge to see a quicker counteroffensive like we have seen previously. Although if it's going to happen anywhere, it might happen in the Kherson area more so than anywhere else. But just thought I'd throw that one in.
I dread to think how many mines are in that forest they're going through at the moment. They're incredibly brave people. And that comes back to the West dithering, dilly-dallying, not getting the weapons, the ammunition, the support that they had at the time. And even now, still, okay, AAkams have come from the US, but not the ones with the biggest range. Still means it's very difficult to launch an attack on the bridge successfully in Kerch in occupied Crimea, because it would need to be a multifaceted. And at the moment, Ukraine just don't have the number of weapons to cause problems there. It's drones. And if they get the new ATACMS, that would help. And the Taurus missiles from Germany. I mean, for Boris Pistorius, the German foreign minister to defense minister to say, it's not a game changer. Nothing's a game changer. It's a cumulative effect. And had everything been given from day one, or as near as possible, or certainly from month 2, when it was evident that Ukraine was able to hold out, this war would have finished long ago. And it's really going to be a black chapter, I think, in the Allies' history when we look back and realize how long this went on for, how long it was tolerated, and how few leaders really stood up to the task that was being asked of them. Yes, in difficult economic times, and yes, democracy has its faults because it allows people to vote people out of office just simply for the sake of their own wallets, perhaps. But further down the line, as we've found countless times, it comes back to bite you. And if you don't support freedom, justice, democracy, the things you fundamentally believe in, things will get well worse down the line. We had our warning signs in Georgia and Crimea, just as we had our warning signs in the 1930s with Hitler, and nothing was done until it was arguably too late and caused millions of lives.
On the tourist front, I mean, I would argue that cruise missiles were a game changer. So Storm Shadow and Scalp, when they suddenly hit, we suddenly saw these targets being taken out that were really, really significant. And then they kind of started running out of them. They do have some, but I don't think they have as many as they originally had. So we're seeing them used far less. And also the planes that carry those, I think they've been attrited as well. So I think tourists are, like you say, they're part of a game-changing thing for me. But I was looking at, because some people are quite defensive when you talk about certain nations, like when I say, oh, the UK aren't doing enough at the moment, and you get some people British who have a go at me, say, we did an amazing job at the beginning. I say, yeah, we did. I'm not denying that. In the same way, I don't deny that Germany did a shite job at the beginning, but now when you look at the list of what they have given, a phenomenal list of equipment, and they've overtaken the UK, and they are playing a massively important part. And I think we need to recognize that people, like nations, can change and start well and tail off, or start poorly and get better, and just recognize that is a moving dynamic.
Agreed. And Germany does donate an awful lot of equipment, but I really don't understand. Well, someone's tried to explain to me why they might not feel able to give away Taurus missiles at the moment, but you should have been looking 6 to 12 months ahead, certainly 6 months ahead. Production should have been stepped up. They could have produced these missiles even inside Ukraine. I mean, maybe they are doing. Maybe we're all just being fooled, and it's quite right to keep silent about it. And one would hope so. We've seen occasionally Ukraine use American missiles that we didn't even know they had. And the F-16s will come soon. They're not a game changer, but had Ukraine had proper air support and air cover from the first days or the first months of this war, that would have made an enormous difference as well. So I mean, game changer in that it fundamentally swings things one way or the other. I would disagree. The British and French missiles certainly helped and gave Russia a wake-up call and caused them to move certain targets, certain aircraft and further away from the front line, which again causes them more logistical problems. But there's nothing so far that I've seen that will absolutely change the game one way or the other. It has to be a cumulative effect, and that means all nations pulling together.
Yeah, and it's frustrating as well with AAkams. What annoyed me is they announced AAkams before they got there, and then they fired one night of them off, and then that did a really good job, and it gave the Russians a chance to say, right, let's move everything out of dodge. You needed them stacked up, ready to go, and just blitz them over like a 3 to 4 night period, firing 100. But I think the way I understand it is they got given 20 as a kind of test, and then they passed the test, because of course they would. And then I have a feeling they've got like 250 odd now, and some more in Germany and whatnot. So at least that's how I understand it. But Tim, this is something on your threads you often report about: relay stations or relay boxes getting set on fire. Ivo Verlek says, why are Russian trains still driving? They can't stop or go left or right. They even have a schedule. How difficult can it be to destroy every locomotive in the occupied territories? I know that they have destroyed, there's certain lines don't really work, like the one coming through Volnovakha that supplies Zaporizhia to the south, which is why they're building a new line through Mariupol along the southern coast. But I presume this is something they are doing, though it is quite easy to fix some of these things quite quickly. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on railways?
Yeah. If I was at the general staff, I'd be looking at the new railway line and just smiling to myself and say, well, let's just let them get a little bit further. We know that they can't protect it all. We can easily blow it up at some point in the future. The relay cabinets, Russia repeatedly says it doesn't cause any delay, any damage. It's a stock answer. Just occasionally you'll see 2 or 3 trains are delayed. Fundamentally, by and large, that seems as though it's a half truth, shall we say. I think there are certain cancellations and they have to reduce the traffic on the line. But it's still a good way for those who are against the war to do something that may have a hindrance to the war effort, and just as well keep police, keep troops a little bit more occupied, keep them on their toes, because more and more people are being sent to the front line from all sorts of industries now. And it was interesting as well to note that was it yesterday or the day before in Hodar in the south, where the nuclear power plant is, that a report from the Ukrainian director of the power company AAkam saying that a lot of the men have been moved out, and we can only assume they've been moved to the front line because of a lack of manpower to try to replace those who've been slaughtered. But they do have problems with the railways. I'd like to see Ukraine hit again the link, both road and rail link between Crimea and Kherson. I think that's tactically important, and I think there must be enough track there to be able to bypass at some point the air defenses with another coordinated and cumulative attack with various different sources. If we can stop the flow from Crimea semi-permanently, then that will be a huge help, especially for regaining ground and maybe regaining the whole of Kherson down to Crimea. And the one thing that we talked about previously, I know, and it was more aspirational then, and now I think it is a possibility that they can achieve it, is to make an insertion right down to the south coast, which would completely cut off the supply routes between the rest of the occupied territory, mainland Russia, and with Crimea, which they still occupy.
I mean, my opinion is hit every bridge. I mean, it's very easy to fix railway lines, really, in all honesty, as in it's, you know, you can do it fairly quickly. What's good is when they hit like fuel trains that then completely burn out areas, and that takes a little bit more time to sort out. But again, you're just fixing tracks. But if you can do that within a train station, then it's more substantial. But hitting bridges aren't easy to fix. And so therefore, you know, if you're going to take out any railway line, you want to take out a bridge. Can I just say a massive thanks to Lawrence for gifting memberships? Really, really generous of you, Lawrence, who then goes on to say the collective West is weakening Russia at the expense of Ukraine. Well, yeah, this is the whole idea of a return on investment. This is money very well spent from a geopolitical, strategic, military strategic point of view, which is if you're going to spend less than 5% of your GDP or less 5% of your defense budget on, I think that's the US expenditure on doing what they've achieved, what the Ukrainians have achieved, and it's Ukrainians doing it for you, then that is a really good return on investment. Can I just say thank you very much to Mitch Mazarol. Morning, JP, Tim, and team. Good morning. Question, Tim. So, and I think this is a really good question. Julian Rossiter says, and thank you very much for the super chat, Julian, really appreciated. If Johnson was still prime minister, so that's a prime minister, former prime minister of Great Britain, who is no longer prime minister due to scandals to do with lying and COVID and all sorts of stuff and things that happen. But he was very strong on Ukraine, where he might not have been, because there was also talk about him having a lot of Russian money going through London, and so people weren't sure he would have been strong. Anyway, would the aid and assistance from UK have been any different if he was still in charge, or is the cupboard bare? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the UK is still providing a lot of help, a lot of equipment, an awful lot of training, which is a huge part, a lot of specialists that the general public doesn't know about. Would it have been any different had Boris been there? Probably there'd be a few more references. Probably he'd have made a few more trips and shone more of a light on it. But I mean, a lot of press releases now just go under the radar. Even the sanctions ones, just people just don't report it anymore, especially in the mainstream media, where the focus seems to have been almost completely taken over by Israel and Palestine. But to answer the question, by the way, Julian, thank you as well. Very kind of you to donate. And if anyone else wants to donate, then please do so. So I wouldn't say the cupboard is bare. I think we are still supporting in a lot of different ways. It's a shame that we can't supply any aircraft, but we have been helping with the training as well. The reasons for that is it's a logistical reason. F-16s are going to be the airplane, the fighter of choice for Ukraine, as it were. Our jets and possibly the French would require more training. It just wouldn't be worth it, and the logistical support for those aircraft would have to be doubled, therefore. But I don't think it would have been substantially different had Boris been there. It would have been more speeches, maybe in the Commons, more reference, more publicity, and a few more people might have read the press releases. But overall, no, I don't think so, actually, Julian or Jonathan.
That's a really good point, because actually, but I think that's quite important, because where Ukraine might be suffering is in the public information space. And Boris Johnson was famously tanking at home popularity wise, but in Ukraine was like a superstar. And so he ended up going to Ukraine quite often because of, I guess, from a personal psychological point of view, which is like, I'm going to go somewhere where everyone loves me. And he would go there and, you know, seem like he was super popular and doing really well because he was in that kind of relatively small area of like everything to do with politics. And so I think he would have visited there and kept it high on the agenda because he knew it was good for him personally. So I think that is quite important. And it also interesting, Tim, what you're saying about training. I think our cupboards are bare. By all accounts, we just don't have the equipment due to underfunding and whatever for many decades. But where we can help is with training, because you don't necessarily need lots of equipment, buying new equipment and giving that to Ukraine. I think that is really important. But I think we are low on equipment. So in that respect, I don't think we would have seen much more equipment given. Another question. Thanks so much, Mitch. Again, good. And I don't know if Mitch has the requisite technical knowledge about this, or Tim, whether he does or not, but does Tim have any insights on a previously announced Elbit Systems contract with Ukraine and what that might entail? M454 SHE round would be nice. So just a little bit of context here. The way I understand this, and I'm no huge expert, but Elbit Systems, I think, is an Israeli company that some were saying had done a contract with an unknown international country. Is like, oh, I wonder who that could be. And there are Israeli bits of kit that would be very useful that Elbit make. I think multiple launch rocket systems they make that, you know, there are rumors they could be on the way to Ukraine, but who knows? I don't know if you know anything about this.
You've just said everything I know, Jonathan. I'm probably mentioned you already, but for other people, it's very useful. No, we're hoping all equipment is useful, and obviously the way that Russia has thrown Israel under the bus in current parlance has really, I think, changed the focus, even for Netanyahu, who was so closely intertwined with Putin and sharing a stage often enough. I think the Israelis have been really shocked by how swiftly, when it suits them, Russia have just changed their allegiance, as it were. And that can only help Ukraine, because anything that damages Russia now will be seen as quite positive by some of the hawks within the Israeli Defense Force and their leadership.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I take it you saw that Israeli politician from the Likud party, more of it on the liberal side, though, have an absolute rant against Russia. Did you want
I think
to just
I posted it. It was great.
Yeah. Did you want to just explain that for people who didn't see it while I just have a look at it?
Yeah, it was on. I think it was probably live, wasn't it? It was on Russia Today, and I think they would have edited it out had it not been live or stopped him very quickly. But he managed to basically just have, as you said, a full-scale rant on Russia and how they were attacking civilians in Ukraine, and how they were incredibly two-faced. I don't think he actually used that expression, but it basically is saying how the propaganda and the Russian position was just appalling. And every single word that he said was great, and it was very amusing to see it on Russia's state propaganda channel.
Yeah, it's just really interesting that they were that he was absolutely slagging off Russia, like properly. He was like once we dealt with Hamas, we're going to do you over. It was like it was really explicit. It was quite incredible. Just to let you know that what Mitch was talking about looks like this. So a unique solution based on pre-fragmented drogue parachute warhead, the M454, is designed to detonate at an optimum height above the target. The SHE-155 mil artillery projectile is 5 times more effective against infantry and light armored vehicles compared to standard HE projectiles. So it's basically like a cluster munition that can be used. And indeed, if you can see that we have here, Elbit Systems to establish an artillery ammunition factory for an unnamed customer. So this, I think, is what Mitch is referring to. So demand for artillery shells and platforms has increased through 2023 as the war in Ukraine provides a capability of such systems in the modern battle space.
Note the date there, Jonathan, as well. It was, what, 3 weeks after the October 7th massacre, wasn't it?
Yes, which is interesting because, I mean, there's an argument, and we can. This is relevant, I think, for the whole Israel aid packages from the US and aid packages to Ukraine, and the idea that Israel need it right away, and lots of it. Actually, they don't really. They've got an established army with loads of stockpiles, no doubt, and they're not really using, like, they are using a lot of bombs from airplanes, but there'll be a certain amount of ammunition that they're not really using at the moment. And actually, it's interesting there to see an Israeli company then thinking about setting up production lines for Ukraine rather than for themselves. So I think, the idea that Israel need US assistance more urgently than Ukraine is just simply not right.
Well, there you go. I would have to agree. I mean, Israel will win that war if it continues. There's about Hamas, it's not a war that they can win. It's a war that they can win propaganda in, and if they will hope to survive and then have more, as they see it, justification for attacking the terrorism and war crimes committed by Israel. But I suspect that Ukraine has long been asking for weapons, for help, for manufacturing help from Israel, and previously it's always been denied, and then suddenly minds were changed, and probably Zelensky's illusionary or someone else has put in a little cheeky request and just said, do you remember that proposal that we have put to you? How are you feeling about it now, bearing in mind what Russia has said? And hey ho, we get a press release 3 weeks after the appalling attacks by Hamas on Israeli territory.
Thank you to Johnny Christensen. Thank you for your membership, Geopol. Johnny from Denmark. Good Danish Johnny there. Thank you. So a lot of this, so before we go to talk about, I was going to talk about the EU a little bit in a little while, but and this is relevant, I guess, the EU as well. It's all about ramping up ammunition production, which is all about as well NATO and allied countries rejigging their own military strategies and realizing that they're not ready for war. And in fact, everyone needs to build load more production lines for artillery. And you're seeing a lot of reaction around the world. The question is that going to, at some point, I mean, there's talk about possibly at one point in the counteroffensive, the Ukrainians had moved to firing more artillery rounds a day than the Russians, which is interesting. So can the combined allies and Ukraine produce more artillery ammunition than the Russians can produce, and also procure from places like North Korea? I don't know, it's a bit of an open question, but any thoughts on like artillery ammunition and sustaining this war in the long term?
The short answer is yes. Yes, they can. Will they? Some of the allies are a little bit more reticent than others. I think Belgium spends almost close to zero, doesn't it? And there've been a few mumblings and murmurings about that. Some countries, as you said, Germany, France hasn't done too badly, the UK, Poland, and all the Baltic states, obviously, a huge amount of their gross domestic product goes into defence, and an awful lot of that goes into Ukraine. Denmark also, as Mr. Christensen has just donated, very good latterly, especially. Norway, I see today, has increased as well. So these sorts of countries are helping, but they're a little peed off, I would think, that some of the other countries haven't been stepping up to the mark as much, have shown no inclination to try to support. But the manufacturing of defence, I think, is really been neglected. It's always been an easy target for governments suffering financially, needing to give giveaways to try and get re-elected. And year after year, it's been plundered. And suddenly there's a real need, and people are waking up to the fact that defence has to come high in the agenda, if not top. And it's about the only thing that I agreed with President Trump on during his time in office, that the US was, in effect, carrying some of the members of the coalition.
Yeah, so okay, a couple of really interesting points there. One, I don't blame people during times of peace to, like, the peace dividend. Like, I can understand, like, if you're faced with a finite budget, like, you don't have endless money, it's like, well, we're not at war, but people are still getting ill. So actually spending a little more on healthcare and a little less on the defense budget, I think is understandable. I would make that same decision. And when you are thinking, well, we're in this kind of period of peace, Russia aren't going to do anything bonkers, that's like, I can understand that. And the problem is that then all falls down when Russia do something bonkers, and we do suddenly recognize we need stuff, but which is, I think that's excusable if you can ramp up really quickly and if you can react. So maybe the long-term strategy is having a really reactive production setup. I don't know, but that's
it's very difficult. I mean, it's very easy to make cuts to defence and spend the money elsewhere. It's then extraordinarily difficult to say, well, yeah, we had COVID, we put all this money in, but now we need to take it back from the NHS in the case of the UK, or the health services in other countries, because we now need to move it to defence. It is a vote loser. And as I said, in democracies, it's the problem we have, that people go on the streets immediately when there are any cuts to healthcare in any country, I think, in the European Union and the UK, but they don't when there are cuts to defence.
So this is interesting, because in the House of Representatives in the US, where people are voted in on a 2-year cycle, and it's more of the House of Representatives than senators who are voted in 6 years. So senators take a much more long-range look at politics and are much more able to look at international foreign relations and diplomacy and think, well, we need to spend money in these big areas. But if you're voted in every 2 years, and same around the world with politicians who are answerable to their constituency, then if your constituency, hey, we need a new hospital, they aren't going to really be going, hey, we need you to spend loads of money on a war over there. So you can kind of understand that the pressure for people. You
can, but let's not forget that one of the requirements when you are accepted and when you join NATO is that you have a commitment to spend 2% of your GDP, which, as Trump pointed out, numerous countries do not do that. Now, had we all been contributing 2.25, 2.3%, and then you get that peace dividend to cutting to 2%, maybe even 1.9, 1.8%, but knowing that you still have the factories, that knowing you still have the troops who are recallable, and you can ramp up very quickly, as you said. And this isn't particularly quickly now. I mean, we're soon going to be talking about the 2nd anniversary. It's a year since liberation of Kherson. How many politicians thought that Ukraine would be able to defend for a long time? How many politicians thought this would be over quickly? It's a 6-month war, it's a 3-month war, it's a year at maximum. And it hasn't been, but it needed some foresight from more leaders. There've been a couple, but it needed a lot more planning and a lot more ramping up immediately. And as I said, I keep banging the same drum. We needed air defense earlier. It would have foreshortened the war. We needed all the big weapons that we had as a coalition to be sent to Ukraine almost simultaneously, rather than, okay, we've got this new toy, and then we've run out of ammunition, or they've been destroyed. We've got these new tanks, they've gone. We've got Bradleys this week. We need things together. We need a whole new army, as it were, to be fighting, so that Russia can't defend against multiple things at once. But we have what we have. We just need to keep going. We need to keep supporting Ukraine so that this war doesn't spill over into NATO territory, because if anyone seriously believes that Putin will stop and that his generals have any power to stop him doing so, or if any of them has the balls to stand up and say no, then I think you're seriously mistaken, because he hasn't got long left to live. He knows that. Could be a year. I'm not one of these that's saying he's dead or he's terminally ill. Yeah, he's not so well. He's an old man, but coming towards the end of his life, he wants to make a mark. And so far, the West has not really responded. And if this is the best we can do, and we defeat them in Ukraine, then sure, we can annex that bit of Estonia, where there are a few Russian speakers, and that bit of Lithuania, and that bit of Latvia, just because that's what we do. We protect Russian-speaking people. If it comes to that, you'll know about it. Your taxes, your foodstuffs, your fuel will all be absolutely sky high, as well as the loss of many, many thousands, I would think, of NATO troops along the line in the ensuing battles that would be necessary.
So really good segue into the next question, actually, from Mark Bizq. But before I get there, you mentioned about spending on NATO. So the agreement being 2% of GDP on your own defense forces is a requirement for being part of NATO. And as Trump said, many countries didn't do that. Interestingly, so someone if there's one thing that gets my goat going, Tim, it's when people on my threads go, right, I really like what you say on, like, this is a geopolitical channel where I do international geopolitical analysis. They say, I really like your analysis of the front line and blah, 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 but don't ever talk about American politics. It's like, hang on, you're happy for me to talk about Russian politics and Ukrainian politics. You don't bat an eyelid. But as soon as I talk about American politics, and it's only because I say something you disagree with about you, and if I'd said something they loved, they'd be like, yeah, you can comment on American politics all you like. But anyway, on this comment from this morning, it's like, and you can't comment on American politics, especially when none of NATO countries pay 2% of GDP. In the US is the only one. I was like, right, okay. Bit of fact checking here, right? So it turns out that 10 countries spend over 2% of GDP, and Poland spends 3.9% of GDP, which is higher than the US. Now, that might not have always been the case, and this has been an issue, and I agree that it's an issue, but actually that's not right now. So you guys all need to check your own facts before you try and make these big claims. But the point being that actually Europe or NATO is responding to this, and it's not everyone, as Tim, you've said, but there are countries who are really, I mean, Poland's going nuts on its army spending at the moment, but there are countries, and then there's also things to consider, and you might have a comment on this because you might have more knowledge about this, but someone like Poland has taken 1.7 million refugees. So while someone in America can make a comment about, well, we're spending 2% of our GDP on NATO, so you guys aren't doing that, so we don't need to help you with Ukraine. But actually, Poland is spending money in other places, like in a welfare and education, sorting out 1.6 million refugees, which the US isn't doing. So there are different ways of dealing with this whole war. Sorry.
No, absolutely. And Germany also had a huge number of immigrants and did a really good job. Even smaller countries, I don't know how I'd feel being in Slovakia now if I was Ukrainian.
Yeah.
And Hungary also, but they also took in a lot of refugees.
And Romania.
I know people who went there. Romania's different because it's always been steadfastly. They've remembered very much the Ceausescu days and the links under the Iron Curtain that was drawn the wrong side of the border for them. But yeah, it's exactly what you say. Some countries are spending more. The Baltic states have always spent way over the requisite. And for any Americans that disagree with my politics or think we should both keep our noses out, I would just say we're not Estonian, Lithuanian, Latvian. We're not Polish. We're not Romanian. We're not even Hungarian, Czechia. These places that have been under oppression are the places that, by and large, are spending the most money to try to ensure that it doesn't happen again. They know what it means to live under the brutal regime that is being recreated now by Putin. Those were his own words, to recreate the Soviet Union, the Union of Russian states. It would be rather than Soviet, I think, these days. But he's trying, and little by little, we've allowed him to succeed. But American politics, I think we all have opinions, and I think that a lot of Americans have opinions on European politics. It is a global challenge.
Freedom of speech.
Exactly. Everyone's entitled to whatever they say. And it's interesting because people say to me, oh, you're such woke, you're such a Democrat. I'm very much a centrist. It's an easy thing to say, but more of the time I used to prefer having a Republican president. But boy, has that changed in the last few years. I hate to see the bipolarization. I hate to see the extreme factions of both taking control. Thankfully, the Democrats hasn't gone down that path yet, but they do need to beware of it.
Particularly worried about Vivek Ramaswamy. Don't get me ranting about him. Don't get me ranting about. Yes,
calling Zelensky a Nazi, trying and then backtracking.
Yeah. I've not seen the backtracking. I just want to get to this.
His team tried to pretend that the comment was made with regard to the when Zelensky was in Canada and when they applauded what turned out to be a previous Nazi war criminal.
Oh, that's a real
clutching at straws, and very small straws in a very big field.
Mark Bisky, thank you so much for this, mate. Really appreciate it. So thank you both
Mark.
for fighting in the and this is something I really wanted to talk to Tim about today, because he's on the front line as well. And I'm not diminishing the front lines in like conventional warfare, but the warfare that is taking place both on the front line in trenches and also in the information space. And this is why it's so important that Ukraine prevail, because there's a chance that you get a regime change in Russia, and there's a chance that Russia will stop meddling, as it is so effectively doing in international politics. And we've heard the US State Department bring out reports or a statement over their meddling in Latin America over the last few days, and how the Russians are meddling in providing anti-US, anti-NATO, anti-Ukraine disinformation into that area. Well, anyway, Mark says our pro-Ukrainian, so he's a Ukrainian Canadian. So our pro-Ukrainian Russian friends tell us an uprising against Putin will never happen. I agree with that. The Kremlin's control over its citizens is firm and unbreakable. I agree with that. But what are your thoughts, Tim?
Maybe I'm being a little naive. Maybe I'm being a little romantic. I wouldn't say it can never happen. I think that's a very dangerous thing for anyone in the Kremlin to assume. And I think Putin's quite aware of that. I think he had quite a shock at the initial invasion of Ukraine and the reaction from the Russian people protesting in favor of democracy. And there was huge rallies in St. Peter and in Moscow also that really shook him. And then he suddenly realized, whoa, there could be a Maidan here in Moscow. Absolutely, crack down, make sure, blah, blah, blah. And we know what happened. So they will crack down hard. I don't think there'll be an uprising particularly about the war. I think the uprising will happen from the general people when it's coming down to finance. And I've written about this in my threads, that the Russian economy is absolutely paramount to this war. And if we can close those loopholes, the evil people who are profiting from war, the companies that are still trading with Russia, and send the Russian economy further down the Swanee, their defense spending, talking about percentage of GDP, is astronomical. And with the ruble stabilizing at the moment, but still an awful lot of income coming through oil, and with oil prices falling again, what little hair he's got left, he'll be pulling out, because with inflation still high, with interest rates being put up to 15% and might have to go higher again early December, I think the next bank meeting over there is, the people are starting to feel the pinch. The price rises, the complaints I'm reading about on social media are getting big, and it's like the old Soviet days. When the price of bread gets too high, there will be street protests, and then other people will have the bravery to join it, and then they'll start discussing among themselves. Oh, isn't it awful? Didn't you hear about so-and-so dying in the war? Oh, it was 12 in our street. Oh, is that all? Well, have you seen the graveyard? And they're not even telling about how many there really are. How many are missing? Oh, I know someone who's missing. Yeah, they're dead. And this snowball effect will happen, but it will be the economy that unseats Putin if the war continues at a stalemate.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think it's worth keeping an eye on the economy. Russia have done a pretty good job of artificially propping up elements of, say, the currency. They're spending an awful lot of their reserves, but they have to be butchering their own welfare state by, robbing Peter to pay Paul. They're spending at least 30% of their budget on the army, on the war. They are increasing in some areas some of their hydrocarbons exports, but they're increasing the crude version. So oil, they might be selling some more oil than they were, but it's not the refined oil, which is where you add value. So they're selling a lot of crude oil cheaply to India, who are then refining it and adding value and selling that on. The net result is that, but in a budgetary sense, Russia are screwed. They're not getting the income that they were. And as you rightfully say, it's about closing those loopholes, which the EU, thankfully, and the US and UK are working really hard to do consistently. I would agree, though, that there are more internal security, unfortunately, agents than there are members of the armed forces, I believe, in Russia. So they have a very tight control. And Putin locks up or poisons or both sometimes anyone who is remotely threatening to him in a powerful position. You look at Surovikin, you look at Prigozhin. What are your thoughts on anyone that might... Do you think there is a threat internally for Putin, politically speaking?
I think the threat, it won't come from a figure we recognize as an oppositionist. I think it will, if there is to be one, come from within. Maybe someone like Patrushev just thinking, this guy's just too senile now and our economy's gone. I can continue in the Putin mold so that I get all the support. But he's got to time it right. And how does he get the armed forces on side? So there'll be a collaboration, I think. I mean, we've seen in Turkey what happens when people think they've got enough support and they've got the support of the armed services, and then it all goes wrong. And Erdogan stayed in power pretty easily, actually. And the academics and the liberals were pretty quickly beaten away. It wasn't a long fight for Turkey to keep Erdogan in power. Patrushev's an interesting figure, does wield a lot of power and influence and does have a lot of supporters, has been ramping up the rhetoric, which I don't always listen to in terms of, take it with a pinch of salt. It's these people like we saw with Medvedev, and I don't believe that the former Russian president, that interim lapdog president, really means what he says when he piles out all this vile diatribe threats to the West. It's just a way of making sure they stay in the public eye and people think, oh, yes, good, strong leader like Vladimir Vladimirovich.
Another question here, and thank you, Mark, so much. I don't know if we've directly up. Well, I think we pretty much answered that. I think there might be
Mark's question, Jonathan. Yes, the answer for me is yes. There can be an uprising. Never discount it, but it won't be from those against the war. It will be a general rising of the population, including people in the army thinking, I can't afford to live on this salary, and they're getting paid pretty well, and a lot of people out of work, and seeing that they can't have any imports and the fresh fruit they're growing is just too expensive because it can't feed the whole country.
Yeah, excellent answer. And thank you for 450 of you out there watching this. That's excellent. Michael Barnett, and thanks for your super chat here. Do Russian troop losses hide a bigger picture of a long-term civil war, with reference to propaganda comments about Dagestan that may reduce war weariness, unify the country? Second World War losses may include a civil war. I'm not quite sure what you mean 100% here. Is there? I mean, the Dagestan situation was pretty interesting with the uprising. Well, not the uprising. The hysterical mob that went out against Jews at the Makhachkala airport there, and that I think represented a bit of a challenge for the Kremlin, because they saw that there's one of their unruly states that was showing a bit of lawlessness. But we do have also higher losses in certain of these areas as well that may put pressure on. I don't know what the dynamic there is, but some people talk about that being overt racism, that they are employing or mobilizing more of these ethnic minorities from faraway regions. But my answer to that, it probably isn't overt racism. Much more likely that they have such low aspiration, which you can argue is a form of discrimination, have such low aspirations there that the only way of moving up is to get money by joining the army. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on any of those ideas, Tim.
Yeah, I agree, Jonathan. I have to say, excellent pronunciation as well of Makhachkala. You've been working hard. You've improved over the last year or two, haven't you? A lot of study.
It's such a hard slog, mate. There are so many consonants that people throw around. But yeah.
Michael, thank you. Yeah, I broadly agree with what you said. It's undoubted that more people are dying from the poorer states, the poorer constituent republics that make up the federation that is Russia. More people are lured into the army because there isn't an economy, because they've been neglected in places, particularly with a different ethnic background, such as Dagestan, but more notably places in the Far East that are less of a threat, like Buryatia, where there's never been any hint of an uprising, whereas within living memory, Dagestan, Ichkeria, Chechnya, have all had serious problems and serious threats against the Russian leadership at the time and under Putin latterly. With regard to Michael's question, I think what he's saying, has it lessened the chances of a civil war? Well, maybe yes, because a lot of people have been killed who might have been around to fight and might have come back from the army and been so disillusioned with the way they've been treated, with the way they've lost a lot of people, and knowing how many deaths have been hidden, that they could be easily turned, or more easily turned, one would think, if there was anti-establishment sentiment rising throughout Russia. Secondly, Dagestan has been whipped into line after originally, as you said, Jonathan, was whipped up into a frenzy by their own anti-Israeli comments from the Kremlin and everyone associated with it directly supporting Palestinians. And then when there's an unruly mob gathering, they suddenly crack down quickly on them. But it just shows how Russia tries to tread a tight line, especially in those southern and mainly or Islamic republics within Russia. There will still be a lot of problem there. We've seen the absolute nepotism, hatred and despotic rule in Chechnya. And one of the reasons for that from Kadyrov is that, of course, he's installed by Putin and he has to be absolutely loyal to Putin, because at any moment there could be another revolution there that topples him and Putin could replace him with someone else. So that dogma continues, and Putin's happy to let Kadyrov continue whilst he's in absolute control. There's no threat of an uprising. So where there isn't an enemy,
so many interesting psychological dynamics, aren't there? You think that international geopolitics is much more of an abstract kind of thing of politics, but actually there are psychological social relationships going on of power and of like, well, I need to second guess what he's going to do, because so I need, with Kadyrov, and as you say, really interesting.
And the point I was coming to was that where there isn't an enemy, Putin, Kadyrov, they have to invent one, because otherwise the people start looking at their own rule. And a lot of people have pointed to the fact hundreds of years that the best way to invoke patriotism is to start a war or get involved in a war. And they have a couple they can choose from now in the southern republics. They can choose to back Palestine, or they can choose to back Russia, or they can choose to back both. But the problem still for a lot of people in the less well-off republics and those miles away from the elites in Moscow and Petersburg is that the army is really pretty much the only career, and therefore they'll still be getting recruits even when they're dying in their hundreds and thousands.
Yeah, you just it's such a good thing, the whole rally round and flag phenomenon, which is where, Margaret Thatcher in 1982, Falklands War, she was doing really badly in the polls, went to war in the Falklands, easily got in the next election. You can look at Bush with 9/11. You can look at so many times around the world where leaders do well because you have that situation where we are all united against a common enemy. It made me think what you're just saying about, if you're living for so long in a kleptocracy that you end up having nothing, the welfare state of Russia is the money has just gone to a few people at the top. No one is doing well out of this, and you start looking around and thinking, this is really shit. I mean, this country is proper crap. And then you start looking at Ukraine over the fence thinking, well, they're doing all right now. Then this is a really good reason for for Putin to do things like that, because it distracts away from the complete dysfunction of your own country, effectively, and the complete inequality from the oligarchs to the poor, and that you just perpetuate then this grievance narrative whereby everyone is just used to everyone craps on Russia, everyone, and then you become this isolationist pariah nation where everyone else is evil and they're all against us. And do you think there's a kind of grievance narrative in Russia? Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I think everything's true that you said. I just wanted to also say that, of course, Putin came to power off the back of fictitiously making an enemy of Chechnya and starting a war. He was
good point.
Kind of forced himself to become temporary leader when Yeltsin was not fit for office, and then started the first Chechen war and proved himself the strong man, and that tag has maintained ever since, even though they effectively lost that war and had to withdraw. So he went in for
fake bombings as well.
Yeah, and demolished when they went in and demolished Grozny. It was just appalling. And the fake bombings of the apartment blocks, that was almost proven beyond doubt, I would suggest. Some people still say it's a conspiracy theory, but if you're wondering what we're talking about, just type into Google or any of the search engine Ryazan bombings or Putin bombings, apartment bombings, something like that, you'll find it. And there are a couple of very good documentaries out there, and a lot of that material is now being deleted in Russia, but there are still TV programs that were, at a time of real openness in Russia, openly debating whether the FSB was involved, and the answer was almost certainly yes. So it comes back to what you said, though, doesn't it, about, I mean, it can't be too easy being Putin in some respects, because you do have all these, we're talking about geopolitics, and for him, it's almost like semi-geopolitics, all the constituent states, and some having more problems than the others, some having real grievances. But it's the mass demonstrations, if and when they start to hit Moscow and Peter, that will really cause him concern. I don't think he's bothered at all, which is why he's allowed Kadyrov to just run his own little fiefdom, really, and Baratier, and even like Sakhalin, and in the Far East, Vladivostok. They're just of no consequence to him. They're as far away as we are from San Francisco. So you can understand why most people in Russia don't even think about what's happening in the Far East or the South, in the Caucasus. It is an astronomically huge country. So when it comes to it, well, Putin's got a balance of that. And the easiest way is for him just to say, okay, you just do whatever you want, basically, to Kadyrov. I'm not going to interfere unless there's some shit that starts hitting the fan, and then I'll crack down on it, as they seem to have done in Dagestan last week.
Yeah, thank you very much to Mark Gould here. Really, really generous. Keep up the good work, gents. Thank you, Mark. Incredibly generous to all the people who have helped out on this stream.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everyone.
I guess just a few more points. I don't know what you're doing for time, but what do you think are the challenges for Ukraine going forward, and how do you think this autumn and winter will pan out? Because I know there's a lot of people who are down on Ukraine given their analysis of the counteroffensive, and it didn't achieve what they initially set out. But my point is that they are in a much better position now than they ever have been throughout this war. They have got air defenses that are far superior to what they have had. They can protect, and we're looking at some massive waves of Russian missiles that I am very worried about. But they're in a better position. They have more equipment. I guess mobilization might be an issue going forward. What are your thoughts on what's going to happen over autumn and winter, and what the Ukrainian challenge is, and what you're quite hopeful about?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Predicting the future is fraught with pitfalls. But as you said, they survived the Ukrainians, and they survived intact. Some horrendous difficulties. I was over there in December, and yeah, it was awful. Power cuts all around. My friends for hours, days at a time, sometimes not having water. Bombs still going off nearby. But with the knowledge that they got through the last winter, and with spirit still very high, determination still very high, all the opinion polls showing huge numbers in favor of never surrendering 1 centimetre of land to Russia, then the added air defences that are protecting won't be infallible. They will still get hit. There will still be problems locally and potentially nationally as well, but they shouldn't be as severe. And that's what my friends and other people in Ukraine and with those with relatives over there need to cling to. Difficult times are ahead. The winter's not easy, even in peacetime in Ukraine, as anyone who's been there will know. But there is light at the end of the tunnel, and the new year will bring that light, and the spring will bring F-16s. And although they're not superior to the Russian aircraft, the fact that they have a more capable aircraft that can help support artillery, can help support the infantry, can help support the front line, and can carry out raids, and just more aircraft means more problems for Russia. Just keep hitting those supply lines, and there will be a huge impact for drones, which, although a lot of cloudy weather and the rains will prohibit easy movement on foot and on the ground, the drones will still be able to operate on the clearer days and those with less dense cloud. And they're getting more automated as well, and they're getting better directions on them. And Ukraine's done some astronomically good work on manufacturing and developing drones. And so I'm still hopeful. I don't see an imminent end, but as I said, things take us by surprise, and it is possible. And I do foresee that in the hopefully not too distant future, the bridgehead will be made all the way to the south coast of Ukraine and cut off the supply lines east to west that go on from Russia and from the occupied territories around Mariupol and Donetsk right the way through to Crimea. If we can make a bridgehead through Melitopol, Tokmak, or through Kherson, it will be a major tactical advancement for Ukraine.
I just think if I was Ukraine now, I'd be saying, just pleading with every nation to get long distance missiles and pleading with them for the ability to strike within Russia, and also as which I think they're doing. And so I think Ukraine are stockpiling and producing and doing innovation into their own missiles and drones with all these capabilities that, like, it's the best way to prosecute a war is to kill the opposition without having a single one of your troops die, right? And so therefore missiles and drones are the way forward. It's just like, how do we not lose people, fire at them with big missiles and take out? So I think the wintertime is a perfect opportunity to do what they've been doing really successfully now for several months, but up times that by 5, times that by 10. Like, cruise missiles are plenty, just flown into Crimea, make it utterly untenable, make the occupied territories of Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk utterly untenable. Just fire. That, I know it's simplistic, but that would be my, like, you know, just, you've done really well on that. Just keep going.
Yeah, I mean,
John, yeah.
Well, just one point on that.
Sorry.
You have to see or try to predict and understand what the reaction would be of the Russian people, and would it, as Russia hoped it would do to Ukraine and the people there, sap their will and make them think,
no, it won't.
What are we doing there? We need to settle this war. We shouldn't be at war. Why are we at war? Why are bombs landing around me? Why are my neighbors being killed? Why are my children being killed? Or will it just make people rally to the flag even more?
I think the latter, sadly.
Yeah, it's a danger that will polarize even more, and even some of the moderate people may then turn against. Now, whether that will make things any worse, how can it make anything worse?
My view wasn't taking that into account. My view was just on taking out strategic, like, air bases and stuff. So, you know, it's about hitting rather than trying to hit the cruise missiles and the ballistic missiles that are flying into your cities in the air. You need to hit them at source. And like, that's all, for me, that should be the number one priority. They seem to be trying, and I don't even notice this, but they seem to be doing a fairly good job of taking out S-300s and high value air defense systems. And I think and electronic warfare systems, particularly on the Dnipro River. I think the Ukrainians are doing a really sound job under the bonnet, where we're not necessarily all completely cognizant of that, of taking out key stuff. They just need to be able to have more ability to do that. They can do it. They just need 20 times more to do that.
Well, that's one of the reasons they've been able to advance in Kherson, is because they've been hitting the rocket launchers, because they've been hitting the air defenses, and they have been able, therefore, to take in helicopters at really low altitude to support, to take out tanks that are firing at them, to take out other targets. and it's daring and it's skilled piloting by the helicopter crews, but they kind of know that the air defences aren't what they used to be there, and so they're able to go in and go out and support the advance of the artillery there.
A couple more super chats. John Panciotti, thank you so much. Thank you, Jonathan, for the work that you do. Really appreciate that, John. Thank you very, very much. Mark here, and again, huge thanks, Mark. Constant Mara, both of you chaps. Everyone fully appreciates what you do. Let's hope support against the Red Tyrant is maintained by giving Ukraine all the help they need. Thank you. And I see this as part of this battle in the information space. Do you see that as what you do? Do you have loftier ideals of what you do, Tim?
No, as I said right at the start when you asked me to introduce myself, Jonathan, it's I feel it's a calling, if you like. It's, well, what can I do? And my friends are there personally living this nightmare. As well as being someone who is socially active and rallying against social justice and trying to live up to what you preach for your children. I've got 2 children. I've always tried to preach about freedom and justice and sticking up for what you believe is right. Now, I'm not donning a uniform and going there as some of my accusatory and bots are writing to me. To give them a slightly politer word than I may have used otherwise. But one does what one can, and it is really important, especially with the mainstream media veering away, that we don't only hear about Ukraine when there is Kramatorsk, some other horrific attack on Ukraine. We hear about what we can report and the steady advancements that are being made at very slow pace, but a bigger advancement will come. And Kherson is just the start. I'm fairly confident about that. And I do it to try to keep this in the public eye, to encourage people. So all those listening now who have come from, because I've publicized it on my own Twitter feed, please make sure that you subscribe and watch Jonathan regularly. And it's not just me, it's other people on Twitter, on other platforms, and I do refuse to use the new name pointedly.
So do I.
Or any of Jonathan's followers that have and
please follow Tim.
Follow me if you can. It's a united effort from all of us outside Ukraine as well as those inside Ukraine to try to provide not completely dispassionate, but a truthful analysis, and therefore a little bit of prediction and some explaining. And I know that Jonathan and myself, we are among the few who try to answer every single question. I will go back in any questions on Twitter. I'll try to answer every single interaction. And it does take a lot of time. We do really appreciate the support because it's become pretty much a full-time job for both of us. So thank everyone who's followed, become a member, super chats, donated in any way, just donating your time as well if you've watched today, and spread the word, and please try to increase awareness.
Well, this brings me on to this question from Murky Turkey here, member. So thanks, Murky. So how do we more effectively get our governments to pull their finger out? It's a really good question, this, because it's made me realize that for all my banging on all day, every day, I haven't contacted my local MP about Ukraine. I've contacted other people and local MP because I often see just them as doing local things, going back to what I was talking about earlier. But I'm now going to, I know her as well. I don't agree with her. She came to a book launch of one of mine some years ago, which is great. But I've argued with her on the side of the street about politics before, and we follow each other on Twitter. So I am going to go to her and do some proper persuasion about, or at least asking questions about Ukraine. But yeah, what are your thoughts about what we can effectively do as individuals to get our governments to pull their finger out?
I think it does come down to it's a good idea contacting your local MP and just saying, are we spending as much as we did last year? If not, why not? Why aren't we supplying more longer range missiles? Under the Freedom of Information Act, can we find out exactly how many missiles we supplied in 2022 and how many we supplied in the first 6 months of 2023 and what we're on course for this 6 months? You might not get answers, but it'll make them start thinking about that. And I think I would like to see, I don't know, I assume something there usually has been, and I'm not in London, there's usually demonstrations organized around key events. The 12-month anniversary unfortunately, of the liberation of Kherson, I say unfortunately, coincides with Armistice Day, so it'll get completely overlooked. But if there's a little demonstration in your area, whichever country you're in, whichever locality, just go out and hold a Ukraine flag and just tell the media about it. Just tell your local newspaper, tell your local radio station, take pictures, put yourself open for interview, and it can all have just a little bit of increasing that understanding and knowledge that this war is still continuing, and we have to ensure that it doesn't grow and come into our own homes as it is for friends of mine in Ukraine right now.
That's a really good point. I don't know if this is a big thing in other countries, but the 11th of November in the UK is Poppy Day, Remembrance Sunday, this Sunday, where there are sort of events on to commemorate the loss of personnel over successive wars, starting originally from 1918. And I might print off a Ukrainian flag and just put that in my front window, just a little kind of to the neighbors. That's where my thoughts are at the moment. And yeah, I guess just having that, opening those lines of communication with your local parliamentarians and being vocal about it as well, just talking about this to friends, putting down talking points that they might be accidentally spouting. Like, I've spoken to people that come around my house, like workmen or whatever, talking about this, and actually most of them have had a pretty good understanding, but I'm freely giving my, what I'm like on my videos, so I'm pretty much like that in real life, which is like, but it's like, no, actually you're wrong about that, and you're wrong because of this and this, and we need to fight that in the information space, which is in our own personal lives as well as being online.
Something else that people can do as well anywhere in the world is mentioning the flag there. I saw a lot of car stickers with Ukraine flags. I saw a lot of people wearing Ukraine colours, and we looked when Zelensky visited the House of Commons in the UK and various other parliaments around the world. A lot of people wearing yellow and blue. Just replace that car sticker or put a new one in. Just replace the "I stand with Ukraine" sticker on your telephone or whatever. Excuse me. Wear a pin tie. Wear yellow and blue for a day, and if it's very noticeably Ukrainian, people will be thinking. They'll, even if they don't say anything to you, oh yeah, God, that war's still going on, isn't it? And they might even be provoked to go and read something about it. And if people stop you and want to engage with you, then you can spread the word and get them reinvigorated and have that sense that justice needs to be done here, because there are still people who don't have a home because their homes were bombed. They haven't been rehoused. There are still people abroad who want to go home. They want to live peacefully. There are still children struggling to be educated because of almost constant air raid warnings in some places. There are people who haven't had a good night's sleep, or more than 2 or 3 good night sleeps, for months because of the air raid warnings in the middle of the night. It's not normal. People think, it's normal now in Ukraine, apart from the front line. It is not normal, and it won't be until we sort it out.
Excellent. Well said, Tim. Thank you so much to my evidently Swedish member here, Per Ludsberg, for those runes that he's thrown this way, or she. I don't know Per as a name, actually. So thank you so much, Per. What
you can say tack, by the way. It's the same. Sorry? I think you can say tack for thank you, whether he's Swedish or Norwegian or Danish.
I should know that the amount of Swedish noir, the Nordic noir series that I've watched. Goodness me, yeah, I've heard more tacks than you can poke a hairy stick at. Okay, as we wind our way to the end here, Tim, is there anything that we haven't mentioned that you think is important to talk about, or points of interest?
I think what we finished on, the most important thing is that, we're trying to keep it in the public eye, and there are people thanking us, and yes, we are doing that, but they have a role to play as well. So go out and make it your resolution, as Jonathan has done, to put something in his window this weekend for Armistice Day, to somehow make sure that you get to speak about Ukraine and the danger that Russia still poses to at least one other person over this weekend, be it Armistice Day or any remembrance service in your country or not, in your locality. Just make sure that you just say, okay, it's a year since Ukraine was liberated. And why hasn't it pushed on? Well, maybe because we haven't supported enough. Maybe Ukraine is still doing really good work. There are still hundreds of people dying from the Ukrainian forces, from people who weren't meant to be soldiers. They didn't sign up to be soldiers. They went to protect their land from being invaded in a completely unjust war. They gave up their jobs as plumbers, electricians, as architects, as even solicitors, people with really well-paid jobs, just rushing to the cause. And they're still there. And we're still happily sat in the warmth in the West. Let's not forget them. Let's do at least something. I urge each one of you, just do something this weekend.
Great comment there. Last thing I'd comment on, I thought this is an interesting thing. I'm surprised there hasn't been more coverage and outrage about the Liberian flagship that was hit. So this was the ship in Odessa that was hit by a rocket, an anti-radiation rocket that I think honed in on this civilian or commercial ship's radar, and then took out part of the superstructure, killed the pilot. Problem here, I'm completely speculating. The problem here, I imagine, is that it's not a ship that's owned by a nation. So it has a Liberian flag, but it will have nothing to do with Liberia. It's got Filipino crew members on board, but it's probably owned by some kind of commercial entity, maybe multinational commercial entity that's interested in making money out of shipping iron ore from Odessa to China. And so therefore, who is there to get really pissed off? Well, actually, the CEO of that company for having to pay out on insurance, maybe to the Filipino family, and cost and the fixing up a ship. But then how does that translate into international outrage? And I don't think it probably does. And that's probably why we've not heard enough about it.
Yeah, I had to go searching for a comment last night that I found from one EU spokesperson, no one particularly high profile, but he is on Twitter, and I did retweet that. And I've searched high and low through the Filipino government websites, which is not the greatest task. I mean, this is what people don't realize, the work that we do in the background to try and bring you the news. And I searched the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I searched the government announcements, I was on about 6 different pages on the website, and I searched Filipino news sites, and there's virtually no coverage. You would have expected some outrage. You know, 3 British sailors being killed on a Liberian flagged ship doing just a commercial job for someone, killed by a missile from a foreign actor. It would have been surely very quickly condemned by our foreign ministry, by our, and it just hasn't happened in the Philippines. And I'm disappointed that that hasn't happened. As you say, it really wasn't the just reaction that such an outrage should have caused.
Yeah, exactly. Well, look, Tim, really appreciate the time you spent with us here. I just want to say a public thanks to Lawrence22, Julian Rossiter, Mitch Mazzarol, Mitch again, and Lawrence22, Mark Bizq, as ever, Michael Barnett, Mark Gold, Tony Otterson, probably mispronouncing half of these names, John Panciotti, and Mark. Really appreciate all of your support. And I did mean to just throw this comment in from Johnny H. Johns when you were talking about the collapse of the economy being the cause. Jake Broyle has always said that the war will be won on the collapse of the economy of Russia, and I think that is true. So anyway, that's pretty irrelevant to the conversation we're just having now, but always good comments from Johnny Johns. So thank you. Just keep up with the with keeping this in the public sphere, in people's consciousnesses. We need to keep talking about it whilst also trying to do everything we can to support Ukraine. And thank you for being part of that, which is kind of what this channel is at least largely about. And thank you, Tim, for doing the work you do. I know I appreciate what you do, and it seems like a lot of the viewers do too. I'll give you I know you said the final words, but I'll give you the final words, mate.
JP, thank you too. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a very good civilized space. Do enjoy the work you do as well. And to answer that question that's on screen now from Tony Utterson, absolutely never give up. We will win. United, we are strong, and we will unite and support Ukraine. Great work from all the guys taking time to watch us today. Thank you to each of you. Hope to hear from you on Twitter. If you can find me, TWMC Limited, and Slava Ukraini.
Absolutely, and I'll put in the description of this video. I'll go and do that now. I'll put Tim White's Twitter handle there, so please go and follow him. And indeed, Slava Ukraini. Take care, everybody. All the very best. Tim, stay on the line, and toodle pips to everyone. And I'll hopefully speak to you with a frontline update at some point today.